North Atlantic, January 1943. Night presses low over a heaving slate sea. A slow freighter shoulders water, her welded plates creaking in rhythm, a single stack smudging the moon with soot. She is ordinary. 4 or 41 feet of cargo holds, derricks, and a tired triple expansion engine pushing 11 knots when the wind is kind. Somewhere ahead, a convoy scatters its white wakes into the dark like chalk lines. Periscope glass cuts the surface. Below, a U-boat trims depth and steadies. The view is clinical. A blunt-bowed, ugly duckling, silhouette plain against the sky, guns at the stern, no glamour, just steel. In the attack center, a hand notes bearing and angle on the bow. The torpedo doors will open in seconds. In the captain's mind, the arithmetic is easy. Slow ship, short solution. Another tally for the tonnage war. Then, faint in the headphones, distant Morse from shore stations. Merchant signals relayed through the ether, convoy list thicker than last winter. Rumors from the pens. New hulls sliding into gray water at a pace no patrol can equal. On the American coast, yard whistles call a night shift to the ways. Sparks fall in sheets. Keels line up like calendar marks. The periscope steadies on one target. The ocean, however, has begun to fill with many. In 1942, the Atlantic turned into an abacus. Every week, the boards in London and Washington added columns that mattered more than speeches. Tons afloat, tons sunk, tons launched. Germany intended to win that arithmetic. When the United States entered the war in December 1941, Admiral Karl Dönitz extended the U-boat campaign to the American littoral. In January, the second happy time began along the East Coast and into the Caribbean. Cities glowed against the water like stage sets. Tankers and freighters sailed silhouetted. Convoys were scarce. Escorts scarcer. From Cape Hatteras to Trinidad, periscopes rose and fell in the backwash of coastal lights. Torpedoes found hulls with appalling ease. The method was practiced. Wolfpacks worked on contact reports and shadowing radioing positions until boats converged. At night, a surfaced U-boat could run as fast as a slow merchantman. In a convoy gap, it could cut angles and attack, disappear and attack again. The Allies knew the counter, the convoy system with escorts, air cover, and disciplined routing. But turning theory into protection took time and hardware. In the first months of 1942, hardware was what the United States lacked most at sea. Escort vessels with sonar, long-range patrol aircraft to close the mid-ocean air gap, and above all, merchant hulls to carry the war's essentials even when losses mounted. Britain's lifeline made the stakes plain. Everything heavy that kept the island and its armies alive crossed water: grain, fuel, ore, trucks, munitions. The Royal Navy's convoy system had kept those lanes open through the worst of 1940-41, but only just and at a cost. Each sunk freighter rippled outward into ration cards and factory schedules. In 1942, when U-boats surged westward, those ripples threatened to combine into a wave. If replacement tonnage could not meet or exceed loss, the sea would begin to close again. The United States held the only lever large enough to move that balance: industrial capacity. Even before Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Maritime Commission had sketched an emergency program for merchant construction. Standardized designs, standardized parts and yards organized for repetitive work rather than bespoke craft. Beauty gave way to buildability. The centerpiece would be the EC-2S C-1 freighter the British had nicknamed an Ocean, and the Americans would call a Liberty ship, 441 feet long, about 10,000 deadweight tons, 5 holds, a single screw turned by a triple expansion steam engine, slow, plain, vastly easier to build than the pre-war freighters that had used riveted plates and 1,000 shipyard tricks learned on apprentices' benches. The choice of slow confounded critics then and now, but it matched the war's math. Speed cost time and money in ways the Maritime Commission could not afford at scale. The crucial variable was how many hulls could be on the water by the end of this quarter, and the next and the one after that. How many decks to stack with drums of aviation fuel, crates of small arms, rations, winter gear, tires, and rails. The engine choice was conservative on purpose. Simple, well understood, and repairable in ports that had fitters but not miracles. The hull form was roomy rather than graceful. The structure embraced welding to save labor and accelerate production. The nickname that stuck, Ugly Duckling, missed the point. The Liberty was not meant to win races. It was meant to show up. While U-boats hunted, the home front tried to catch up. In the spring of 1942, blackouts rolled down the seaboard. Coastal convoys stiffened. Destroyer escorts and corvettes trickled into service. Long-range patrols from Newfoundland, Iceland, and Northern Ireland began to nibble at the mid-Atlantic gap. Yet sinking stayed high because the U-boats exploited the time lag between policy and presence. Dönitz believed he had a number that could break. Britain, sink more than the Allies could build, often framed in contemporary staff work as roughly 700,000 tons a month to inflict cumulative collapse. For months, the curve flirted with his requirement. The American answer started as policy and became geography. New and expanded yards rose where rail met deep water, along the James and York Rivers in Virginia, in Baltimore and Bethlehem Fairfield, across the Delaware, at the mouth of the Columbia, in the Bay Area and Los Angeles, at Richmond on the East Bay, in Portland, Oregon, in South Portland, Maine, in New Orleans and along the Gulf. The names on the gates varied: Kaiser, Todd, Bethlehem, Newport News, but the logic inside converged. Prefabrication in shops, welded panels traveling by crane to ways. Parallel hulls advanced like a production line. Training schools produced welders by the thousands. Women and minority workers entered trades that had been closed. 3 shifts kept arcs burning under winter snow and summer heat. The first Liberties took months from keel to launch. The average fell to weeks. The record, measured in days, was a stunt with a point. The system, when fed material and labor, could compress time to a degree the enemy could not match with torpedoes. Convoys felt the change first as a subtle increase in mass. Schedules thickened. A loss column still ran to shocking totals, but manifests began to rise again as new hulls joined the lanes. Escorts improved. Routing tightened. FDF on escorts started to catch U-boat transmissions. Centimetric radar and better air cover clawed back the night. None of that made a Liberty a better individual ship. It made her one of many, and the ocean rewards many. The U-boat arm knew how to sink a slow freighter. It did not yet reckon with a nation deciding to flood the sea with them. The next section steps behind the cranes and into the sheds, into the pattern lines, welding schools and yard rituals that turned paper orders into steel hulls faster than contempt could keep up. If 1942 began as a deficit in hulls, the answer took shape under traveling cranes. American emergency yards were not old-line craft shops enlarged. They were factories laid sideways along tidewater, steel arriving by rail, parts moving in set paths, and whole ships assembled from prefabricated sections. The principle was simple: do as much as possible under cover on level floors at waist height, then lift large, finished modules to the ways. Where a riveted freighter once grew plate by plate, a Liberty ship arrived in panels, shell plating with frames already attached, deck houses built in shops, stern and bow units wired and piped before they ever saw rain. Welding replaced most riveting, saving both time and skilled labor. A panel line that learned the rhythm could turn out repeatable sections like a cadence. Arc light, slag chipped, gauges checked. Another section rolled to staging. Henry J. Kaiser became the public symbol of this speed revolution, but the system sprawled far wider than one name. On the West Coast, Permanente Metals at Richmond ran yards number 1 and number 2 on the East Bay, while Oregon Shipbuilding at Swan Island and Kaiser Vancouver along the Columbia hammered out hulls under weather that swung from sleet to high sun. On the Gulf and Atlantic, Bethlehem Fairfield at Baltimore, Newport News, South Portland in Maine, New Orleans, Savannah, Jacksonville, Wilmington, North Carolina, and California, and a constellation of other yards taught cranes to speak the language of schedule. Rail yards at their backs and deep water at their feet made geography an ally. Ore, plate, engines, and men flowed in. Ships slid out. Workforce was the second pillar. The emergency program trained an industrial army of welders, burners, fitters, riggers, and crane operators in months, not years. Schools built mock-ups and drilled technique into hands that had never worn leathers before 1941. Women stepped into trades from which they had been barred. Black workers and other minorities, long excluded by unions and gatehouses, entered in numbers the war could not do without, often still fighting for fair assignment and promotion, but present in the yards in a way that reshaped both production and post-war expectations. Shift whistles made time into a public event. 3 8-hour shifts, 24 hours of arc glare on steel that went red in winter and too hot to touch by noon in summer. The Liberty that moved down a set of ways in 1942 looked like the opposite of romance. She was 441 feet long, with 5 holds under king posts and booms, a cruiser stern, about 10,000 deadweight tons, and a triple expansion steam engine chosen precisely because it was conservative. Parts available. Repairable in any port with a decent machine shop, fuel efficient at convoy speeds. Designed as EC2SC1, she could make roughly 11 knots in fair weather. The ocean generally got the better of the rest. Gun mounts for a 4 or 5-inch aft, and light AA dotted her decks as the war thickened. And naval armed guards slept where peacetime deckhands once played cards. Speed was in the yard, not the hull. Early liberties measured build time in months, then the curve bent hard as routine set. Keel to launch averages slid into weeks, and publicity builds proved a point about potential. The most famous, SS Robert E. Peary, went from keel laying to launch in 4 days and some hours in November 1942, a carefully staged sprint at Kaiser's Richmond Yard No. 2 that required pre-assembled sections, crowded ways, and an army of supervisors with stopwatches. It wasn't normal. It was a signal flare that told sailors and U-boat skippers alike what the system could do when it pressed. Other records followed in days and a handful of weeks. More important were the averages that kept shortening while quality stayed within tolerances a convoy could live with. Welding, the great time saver, carried new risks that the yards and the design bureaus learned to manage in real time. Brittle fractures, cracks that could run across welded plate in cold seas, appeared on a minority of hulls, often at hatch corners and cutouts where stress concentrated. Engineers answered with crack arresters, better notch toughness in plate specifications, revised hatch combings, and closer inspection regimes. The fix was empirical and fast, and it worked well enough that the Liberty's reputation settled not on failure, but on survivability and repairability. A hold bow might be boxed and sailed to a yard, a broken shaft swapped, a scorched hold shored and reloaded. The ship's simplicity was itself a weapon. More crews could keep more hulls moving with fewer tools. Production culture wrapped itself around families as much as cranes. Cafeterias ran at all hours. Daycare improvisations and boarding houses sprang up near gates. Bond drives and posters turned welding arcs into civic theater. Yard newspapers printed the names of crews that beat schedule. Launch days felt like holidays under rationing. Speeches brief, christening bottles loud. A hull sliding into the slip with a churn of brown water that soaked the first row and sent a cheer down the quay. Supplies that would cross U-boat lanes began their lives amid confetti made of time cards. The macro picture changed with the micro rituals. With each month in late 1942 and into 1943, more hulls joined convoys than left them. Routing became stricter. FDF on escorts triangulated U-boat transmissions. Centimetric radar and lee lights made night surface attacks hazardous. Long-range patrols and escort carriers began to stitch shut the mid-Atlantic air gap. Liberty ships did not outrun submarines. They outnumbered outcomes. Convoy commodores could accept a known loss rate per crossing if replacement and repair stayed ahead. The convoys began to look denser on a wall map, the gaps between sailings shorter, the berths at Liverpool and the Clyde busier even after a bad week. Critics kept their phrases, ugly, slow, targets, but the sea cares little for adjectives. It balances manifests and arrivals. By the opening months of 1943, enough liberties were in gray water that U-boat skippers started to meet not only individual ships but a system. Escorts tricked out with new gear, air cover appearing farther offshore, and convoys whose mass made the mathematics of attack less forgiving. The industrial answer had reached the ocean. That is the pivot this film must now examine from multiple angles. The enemy's view and errors. The industrial method that imposed a calendar on the sea. The logistics that turned tonnage into strategy. The home front human story. And the tactical technologies that tightened the vise while hulls rolled off the ways. From a U-boat's attack center, a Liberty looked like the perfect problem already solved. Big radar echo. Fat silhouette, slow turn rate, and a speed that kept torpedo solutions short. Crews called them ugly ducklings, a sneer that doubled as a range cue. Doctrine favored night surface attacks in or ahead of convoys, close to periscope depth in daylight, then racing on diesels after dusk to fire from the flanks or slip into the columns. The captain's slide rule loved standardization. If every merchantman behaves in predictable ways, you can drill the angles until your hands find them in the dark. What the enemy misread was replacement speed. Dunitz's arithmetic assumed a threshold. Sink more gross tons per month than Britain and America can replace, and the lifeline thins toward collapse. In early 1942, this looked attainable. By early 1943, the curve bent. Liberty hulls began to arrive faster than patrols could erase. Worse for the U-boat arm, each month's production didn't just refill losses. It increased convoy mass, raising the cost of every attack. Wolfpacks that once found scattered singles now met tighter columns with more escorts, better sensors, and air cover creeping ever farther offshore. Contempt for the individual ship blinded the force to the strategic reality. A slow, plain, well-built freighter is dangerous when it is one of hundreds that will keep showing up. The periscope still saw targets. It just saw too many to change the war's trajectory. Emergency yards inverted the old craft sequence. Riveting gangs on staging gave way to panel lines under roof, where frames and plating married at waist height. Welders followed chalk marks. Fitters pre-ran pipe. Electricians wired deckhouses on shop floors. Sterns and bows were jig-built, complete with machinery foundations before a crane ever swung. The yard's choreography mattered as much as the crane's lift. Steel by rail into stockyards. Cutlass to burning tables. Sub-assemblies onto rollers. Completed modules staged by sequence and a foreman's clipboard that read like a train timetable. Module A to weigh 3 at 1400. Deckhouse to weigh 1 at 1630. Speed was cumulative, not miraculous. Training schools fed the lines a steady stream of welders and burners. Quality control spotted brittle fracture risks and fed lessons back into design, adding crack arresters, changing cutouts, revising procedures in the same month the fault was found. Safety men walked with chalk to circle defects. X-ray crews checked critical seams. Inspectors signed off not once but multiple times between shop and ways. When a hull slid, a second waited 2 bays down and a third sat in sections ready to move. The result wasn't just a launch. It was rhythm. Schedule stabilized. Averages dropped. The publicity 4-day sprint proved the ceiling while the median quietly did the work. In that rhythm, the Liberty's supposed weaknesses became virtues. Simple engines could be installed fast and fixed anywhere. Straight runs of deck and standard hatch gear simplified fabrication and repair. The design's repeatability made the ocean a function of the calendar. Convoy war is accountancy with waves. Each crossing involves a known risk. Call it a loss rate per 100 ship days. Tactics and sensors aim to push that number down. Production and repair aim to outweigh whatever remains. The Liberty program shifted the decisive variable from the performance of any single hull to the presence of many hulls. 11 knots in a vacuum is vulnerability. 11 knots inside a 60-ship convoy with HFDF on the escorts, centimetric radar searching the squalls, and long-range aircraft overhead becomes acceptable throughput. If 55 make it with full cargoes and 5 are lost, and if next month launches replace 7, then the line stays not just open but thickens. Cargo content magnified the effect. Liberties carried what multiplies force: fuel in drums, rails, and trucks for distant depots, tinned rations, artillery ammunition, crated aircraft parts. Delivered on schedule, those items create second-order tonnage, the capacity to build more airfields, run more locomotives, move more divisions. The logistic curve does not care that a victory ship is prettier or faster, if the Liberty shows up now with the bulk the front actually needs. Yard output raised the convoy's statistical weight, while improving escort tactics and technology lowered U-boat hit probability. The two curves crossed in 1943. The ocean's net flow turned allied. This math is unsentimental. It rewards enough, not excellent, if enough arrives in time. The Liberty was designed to be enough. Again and again, the enemy's view, the yard's method, and the convoy's math together set the stage for the remaining forces tightening the vice. Technology at sea and in the air, the home front human engine that kept cranes moving, and the design adaptations that bridged Liberty to victory. While yards fed hulls to the sea, escorts learned to find whispers. High-frequency direction finding, HFDF, Huff-Duff, mounted on convoy escorts took bearings on U-boat radio bursts and cross-fixed their source within minutes. The moment a pack commander signaled, a destroyer knew roughly where to sprint. Centimetric radar, working on shorter wavelengths that painted periscopes and conning towers, reduced the U-boat's night advantage. In the air, Lee light search lamps on patrol bombers converted radar contact into a sudden white cone that trapped a surfaced submarine between beam and sea. Crash dives came too late when depth charges were already rolling. On the surface, forward-throwing weapons like Hedgehog pitched contact-fused bombs ahead of the escort, so the sonar picture did not vanish under the ship's own prop wash. Convoys gained air shoulders as long-range Liberators and Sunderlands pushed patrol lines farther from land, and escort carriers, small decks on merchant hulls, brought fighters and bombers into the mid-ocean gap once thought immune. The tactical rhythm inverted. Packs that once shadowed from dusk to dawn now faced counter-shadowing. Escorts turning toward the bearing, aircraft appearing where none had ranged, radar finding the head of a periscope in rain. Even when a Liberty died, the attack often cost the pack time, depth charges, and sometimes boats. The vice worked because technology synchronized with production. A U-boat could stalk one hull, but it could not stalk the system. Escorts with better ears, aircraft with longer legs, and convoys swollen with replacements. The seize percentage moved a few decimal places at a time, until Black May 1943 wrote the new balance in wrecked submarines and broken morale. Industrial miracles are made of ordinary shifts. Yard gates swallowed night crews in wool caps, lunch pails under arms, faces pale in arc light. Women welders learned bead control on scrap before laying seams on deck houses. Riveters became burners. Riggers taught rookies to trust the crane's slow swing. Black workers moved from labor gangs into skilled positions as training and demand pried open old doors, even as they pushed against segregation's hard edges in housing and promotions. Cafeterias served hot plates at midnight. Bulletin boards filled with bond drives, blood drives, safety tallies, and proud lists of teams that beat schedule. Child minding improvised in church basements and front rooms so parents could make call time. The work was loud, repetitive, and dangerous. Burns, falls, crushed fingers. Every yard kept a roll of names and a wall of posters to keep that roll short. Yet pride traveled faster than fear. Each launch drew a crowd. A bottle broke, a bow moved, and a sheet of brown water surged up the ways, soaking the first ranks and setting off a cheer that belonged to cargo that would exist. Flour, fuel trucks, crates of parts, rails and ties. Newspapers carried photos of rows of keels like calendar pages. Families counted hulls as if they were suns on the line. The human engine did not see a U-boat. It saw a deadline and a number, and the knowledge that somewhere east of the horizon a convoy would need exactly this ship. The Liberty's genius was not perfection, adaptation. As brittle fracture lessons came in, designers added crack arrest details, changed steel specifications, and refined weld procedures. Armament crept upward, a 4 or 5-inch gun aft, Bofors and Oerlikons where crew could stand a watch. Navy armed guard detachments drilled to fight off a surfaced run-in or aircraft in the Bay of Biscay. Ice belt strengthening appeared on ships bound for northern routes. Cargo handling improved with standardized winches and booms. Spare parts traveled with each hull so repairs could begin in port without waiting on a rail car. Then came the Victory ship, faster and finer lined, with steam turbines for 15-17 knots, an evolution that owed its speed to the Liberty's production lessons. But the Victory did not replace the Liberty so much as stand on her deck. The ocean needed both. Fast ships to shift high-priority freight, and a river of Liberties to carry bulk and redundancy. Modifications spawned sub-roles, tank Liberties fitted to carry petroleum, hospital conversions, repair hulks, ammunition carriers with extra precautions, even block ships later sunk to form artificial harbors off Normandy. The class multiplied not just in count but in purpose. At sea, repair culture finished the concept. A Liberty took a hit, limped into an emergency harbor, watched a patch go on and sailed again. Crews learned the ship's plain ways, cursing her role and praising her stubbornness. The design's flat truths, roomy holds, simple plant, replaceable parts made her easy to keep in the fight. U-boat skippers still smirked at silhouettes. Convoy commodores counted arrivals. The angles converge on a single inflection. 1943. When new tactics and new sensors met a flood of hulls, and the Atlantic's arithmetic changed in a single campaign season. March 1943 opened with a convoy battle that showed both the danger and the hinge. HX-229 and SC-122, two Atlantic convoys staggered across the same weather, were found and harried by wolfpacks in a running action that lasted days. Snow squalls cut visibility to the length of a mast. Sea states threw decks like trampolines. Escorts fought blind on radar and ASDIC as U-boats dived, surfaced, and dived again. Torpedoes found hulls. Fires climbed out of number 3 holds and walked aft. The loss lists for those convoys were heavy. Dozens of ships in combined tallies across the two groups. On board the boats, the radios crackled with victory notes the arm had learned to distrust but wanted to believe. On Allied walls, grease pencils circled a hard question. Could the curve still bend in their favor if this kept happening? The answer arrived not as a single order, but as simultaneous pressures that finally aligned. Escort groups on the North Atlantic run, now steadier in composition and better trained as teams, began to hunt while escorting, using HFDF bearings to swing outward at the first hint of a control boat's transmission. Centimetric radar showed periscopes and conning towers as crisp returns that older sets had missed. Wide-area air patrols, Liberators with extra tanks, Sunderlands patrolling the western approaches, Catalinas and Hudsons filling edges, pushed the reconnaissance rings outward and closed pieces of the mid-ocean air gap that had sheltered night surface attacks. In the dark, a lee light could turn a radar contact into a white cone of revelation before the watch officer could shout, "Alarm!" and stamp the dive klaxon. On the surface, Hedgehog crews threw contact bombs ahead of their bows, keeping sonar on the target instead of losing it under their own screws. Individually, none of these changes guaranteed safety. Together, they inverted the night. At the same moment, the ocean itself thickened with new hulls. Liberty ships joined convoys in numbers that mattered not on a pierhead but on a wall map. Sailings more frequent, columns deeper, dispersal less likely because there were ships to keep formations full after weather or damage thinned a line. Escorts multiplied too. Destroyer escorts and corvettes that had once been paper now showing up in paint, their pennant numbers chalked onto blackboards and escort group messes with a quiet pride. The convoys grew into systems, signal plans, air cover rendezvous, refueling in anchorages, rehearsed responses to shadowing reports. The operational effect was simple. U-boats had to spend more time to achieve the same results. And time is the currency a submerged predator has least of when batteries and air run down. The shift sharpened in April and wrote itself in steel in May 1943. Patrol, lines that once promised easy approaches, began to deliver ambushes. Boats surged on a plotted track and found themselves under radar, forced down before they could fan out. Others survived the first day only to be lit and charged at night. Depth charges stepping down the ladder of pressure settings with a grim professionalism born of long practice. Controllers ashore started to see a pattern they could not ignore. Boats outbound, boats missing, boats returning scarred. Sinking still achieved but at cost ratios that turned pride to arithmetic, and the arithmetic looked bad. Within convoys, the human texture changed with the numbers. Merchant captains who had stared into blackness for months began to see friendly silhouettes more often. An escort sliding out of fog toward a HFDF bearing. A shadow of an aircraft wing tight-turning into a cloud break. A second and third column keeping station instead of trailing scattershot across 10 miles. In radio rooms, operators copied the same escort group call signs patrol after patrol, and familiarity turned into a quiet confidence that procedures would hold under stress. A Liberty's crew still felt her roll in a quartering sea and cursed her speed when the Commodore demanded an extra knot. But they also learned the tempo of modern convoy fighting. Alarms, hard turns, return to course, and the dull comfort of a schedule that resumed after the shock. For the U-boat captains, the ocean did not become empty of chances. It became crowded with traps. A radar contact that once meant a sheep in the dark now often meant a shepherd. A high-frequency burst to report a convoy's position, doctrine for years, began to pull knives toward the sender. Batteries drained while evading. When a boat surfaced to charge, the horizon no longer guaranteed anonymity. A long-range bomber might materialize out of weather that used to be sanctuary. Talk in pens and planning rooms shifted tone. The word attrition, once reserved for merchantmen, began to attach itself to boats and crews. On shore, the industrial curve kept rising. Yards that had celebrated publicity sprints in 1942 now hit their stride in averages. Keel-to-launch time settled into a rhythm counted in weeks. Outfitting became its own refined assembly line. Repair yards learned to turn around damaged Liberties with speed that felt like cheating fate. The effect on convoy tables was cumulative. Replacements were not just keeping up with losses. They were creating surge capacity. room to stage operations in the Mediterranean and build stockpiles in Britain without starving the Soviet route or the Africa-Italy pipeline. U-boats could not be everywhere. Liberties could. The hinge moment earned a name because it was undeniable. Black May saw U-boat losses spike to a level the arm had never known. Boats were sunk or damaged at rates that forced donuts to pull back, reconsider doctrine, and admit that the North Atlantic had become a defended factory floor rather than a hunting preserve. The immediate causes lay in radio bearings, radar sets, escort carriers, and disciplined groups. The deeper cause lay in mass. Enough hulls, enough escorts, enough aircraft, enough repair capacity to turn each tactical improvement into strategic certainty. By late spring, the convoy commodore's problem had changed. It was no longer whether he could get any group through. It was how many he could push at once, and how quickly he could refill columns after a hard fight. The ocean's center of gravity had moved. The U-boat could still kill, but it could not starve. What remained was to show how production pace crystallized into a single emblem. Yards launching ships every few days, one record hull in 4 days and change, and how that pace felt on slips and seen on newsreels, translated into a strategic verdict the Atlantic would not reverse. The shift at sea had an echo on land you could set your watch to launch days that arrived like weather fronts at Richmond's Yard No. 2. The ways were never empty. A hull slid. Another waited 2 bays down with her numbers chalked and her keel blocks warm from the last torch. Across the Columbia at Swan Island, cranes stepped through their arcs as if rehearsed to music. Bethlehem Fairfield on the Patapsco thundered through shifts that did not care if it was Sunday. South Portland woke to whistles and went to sleep under their memory. A visitor could stand on any catwalk and read the calendar in steel. Bow units lined like dominoes, deckhouses shining with new paint, stern frames ready to catch the river. The record sprint, the SS Robert E. Peary in 4 days and some hours, was the headline. But the quiet victory lived in the median. Yardmasters learned to build ships in weeks, then outfit in more weeks, and deliver a working freighter with a plant a merchant crew could know by smell before the end of a second cup of coffee. The publicity hull proved that the system could compress time like a vice. The ordinary hulls proved that it could do so reliably. Launch ceremonies shrank in speech and grew in frequency. Bottles shattered, bows moved, and brown water climbed the ways in a ritual that meant one thing to men reading convoy tables. More columns. Convoys felt the pace as mass. Schedules tightened until the wall maps in Liverpool and New York looked like crosshatching, where cancellations once opened holes. Replacement hulls now backfilled. A freighter lost off Iceland had a sister ready to join SC or HX in days, not in quarters. Escorts multiplied and trained matched the tempo. Escort carriers brought air where none had flown. Hedgehog and HFDF took the guesswork out of night defenses. Centimetric radar burned through rain to paint periscopes at ranges that had seemed fantastical in 1941. The U-boat arm still struck, but every attack had to claw through an environment the enemy no longer controlled. On the plodding floors ashore, the tonnage curve, that unromantic, crucial line, tilted. In 1942, monthly Allied losses threatened Donitz's target thresholds. In 1943, launches plus repairs outpaced sinkings and began to add reserve. A convoy commodore could plan for losses and still deliver cargoes in volume. The math reached the front as stuff. Pole drums stacked like city blocks, rails and locomotives for North Africa's yards, trucks nose to tail on weather decks, ammunition in crates that said nothing but meant everything. A slow ship made the difference because she existed, and because another took her wake. The U-boat pens read the same curve from the far end. Patrol lines that once promised an evening's hunting turned into attrition zones. Reports arrived thin or late. Boats failed to report at all. A captain who had sneered at a Liberty's slab sides now counted minutes on the surface with a caution born of radar. In May 1943, the books closed on a month that the force would remember in black ink. Losses stacked, boats sunk with all hands, boats limping home with crews bandaged and hulls dented, boats written off for training because the front could not absorb the cost of another patrol cut short by better ears and longer wings. Donitz pulled boats back, changed tactics, recalibrated hope. The pace of American yards did not slow to celebrate. It normalized. 4-day sprints faded into lore. 14, 21, 30-day keel-to-launch averages filled out the reality that mattered. Repair culture joined the rhythm. A Liberty that took a torpedo abaft the beam could be boxed and sent to a stateside yard. Another that wrinkled plates in ice could be straightened and returned to service. Maritime Commission men called it availability. And availability was the number the war needed. How many hulls were ready to load this week and next? By late spring, the Atlantic felt different to sailors who had lived it in 1942. A Liberty's bridge still read wind and swell. Her engine room still sweated. Her armed guard still checked the belts on oerlikons that jammed at the worst time. But her chances had changed. She sailed in company more often than not, with an escort group that could hunt back and an air umbrella that reached out like a moving harbor. When a periscope did break water, it played to odds that no longer favored the attacker. The emblem of the turn was not a single dramatic shot at sea. It was a portfolio of ordinary images, cranes walking, arcs hissing, a launch every few days in a dozen yards, a convoy list thick enough to make a wireless operator sigh before he began copying. The industrial metronome beat under every tactical improvement. For the U-boat arm, it meant the ocean could be contested but not controlled. For the Allies, it meant planning for Sicily, for the Mediterranean's churn, for the stockpiles in Britain that would one day roll down lanes to temporary harbors off a French coast. In every statistic that followed, Black May's losses, convoy delivery rates, the declining kill-per-patrol ratios, the same cause ran beneath the numbers. Output. You can sink a ship only once. You can launch a ship again and again. The turning point was complete. The next task is to count what survived and what was lost, to write the victory in the ledgers that decide campaigns and to see the cost written in names and plates. Victory in the Atlantic did not arrive as fanfare. It arrived as ledgers that stopped bleeding. The same boards that had once tallied deficits in hulls and escorts began to show net gains. Loss curves bent, delivery curves lifted. The convoy tables that had looked like pleas in 1942 read like schedules in late 1943. Count it where sailors feel it first. Arrivals. Liverpool, the Clyde, New York, Halifax. Harbor masters logged more ships coming in full than going out light month after month. Where a hard crossing in the spring might still show a handful of red marks, the next sailing already had replacements assigned, pulled from a yard whose average had become a promise. Repairs kept pace. A Liberty singed black along number 4 hatch could be boxed, stripped, and returned to a berth with a new paint smell before the crew's letters home had finished their first leg. The fleet itself took on a scale that changed the conversation. By war's end, thousands of standard cargo hulls, over 2,700 Liberties among them, had joined the Allied merchant ranks, their names reading like a national roll call set in steel. Even before that final tally, by late 1943, the concentration of hulls in the North Atlantic meant that a convoy commodore could thicken columns rather than juggle gaps. The ugly Ducklings were no longer a stopgap. They were the baseline, the ordinary against which planners wrote extraordinary operations. The cost remained visible. Merchant mariners and naval-armed guard detachments paid a casualty rate that never dulled. Lifeboats still swung out under tracer. Smoke still climbed from holds and plates still buckled in cold seas. Escorts that had learned to hunt back also buried their dead. The turn of the statistics did not erase the faces in the photographs tacked to mess bulkheads, or the lists read at memorials ashore, but it altered the odds under which those men sailed. A crossing in late 1943 carried a different arithmetic than a crossing in early 1942. In the yards, the aftermath looked like refinement. The publicity stunts faded. The averages stayed low. Foremen who had learned to count in days kept counting in days. Welding procedures matured. Crack arrest details became habit, not fix. Quality control wrote itself into the rhythm of shifts. The repair culture expanded into a science. Standardized patch kits, traveling teams, manuals that spoke a plain language of measurements and tolerances, lessons absorbed by new crews faster than the ocean could erase them. On the plotting floors, Black May 1943 sat like a nail in the calendar. U-boat loss rates that forced donuts to step back and rethink, that turned patrol lines into cost centers rather than profit columns. After May, boat operations continued, and ships still died, but the kill per patrol figure drifted downward while Allied availability drifted upward. Escort carriers multiplied. Long-range liberators filled the last bad gaps. HFDF and centimetric radar moved from novelty to standard kit. The convoy system, never perfect, became confident. The thing the sea noticed was mass. A slow ship alone is a tragedy waiting for a masthead light. A slow ship inside a convoy that now peopled the horizon with silhouettes became part of a moving fortress. Escorts out on the shoulders, aircraft visiting by appointment, procedures that clicked under pressure. When the periscope broke the outnumber surface, it met a picture that did not favor solitary hunters. By winter, the Atlantic had turned and every other theater felt the pressure ease. Tankers to keep the air forces flying, rails and trucks to stretch supply lines in North Africa and Italy, ammunition and food in volumes that made planners think about stockpiles, not triage. The ugly ships, launched in small ceremonies repeated so often they blurred, had done what they were built to do: exist in numbers. Existence became outcome. The ledgers closed one chapter and opened another. With the Atlantic stabilized, the question shifted from can we keep Britain alive to how much combat power can we stage and how fast. The answer would be written in ports filling past the point anyone had believed possible in 1942, and in beachheads that depended on ordinary hulls arriving on days that had names. The next section widens the aperture, what this new balance enabled. Across campaigns and how a ship built to be enough changed the pace and reach of the war itself. Stability at sea does not end a war, it enables one. Once convoy tables steadied in 1943, planners stopped asking whether Britain could be kept alive and started asking how much combat power could be staged, how far and how fast. The answer rolled in on low, plain bows. In the Mediterranean, the flow changed tempo first. North Africa's ports, Algiers, Oran, Beaune, received locomotives, rails, tank transporters, bridging, aviation gasoline, and rations in volumes that turned highways and quays into moving depots. That mass made Husky feasible in July 1943. Sicily, taken by a force whose appetite for fuel and ammunition would have been impossible to satisfy in 1942. The same river of steel kept Avalanche alive at Salerno and fed the long, bruising climb up the Italian peninsula. Merchant losses continued, but the net lines on the wall maps held green. In the North Atlantic, stockpiles in Britain grew past comfort into confidence. Depots in the Midlands and around the Solent stacked ammunition and POL by the acre. Airfields multiplied. Vehicle parks filled. Training areas swallowed counties as divisions rehearsed road marches and embarkations. The calendar pushed toward a morning when harbors would have to disgorge everything at once. When that moment came, the backbone was not glamour, it was availability. Liberty ships delivered vehicles and ammunition to British ports through the winter. Then, in June 1944, some sailed as cargo carriers, others as block ships, sunk deliberately to form gooseberries that quieted water for temporary harbors off Normandy. Ordinary freighters helped build the stage, and then stood in the wings while mulberries and landing craft did their work. Elsewhere, the new balance freed choices. Tankers and cargo ships supported the Arctic convoys when weather and threat allowed. More significantly, the steady Atlantic routine underwrote the Persian corridor, where hulls disgorged American vehicles and supplies at Gulf ports before trains hauled them north to the Soviet front. In the Pacific, separate production lines built oilers and transports on a massive scale, but the Atlantic's calm meant planners did not have to rob one theater to feed another. A world war that had run on shortage began to run on schedule. The Liberty fleet's very ordinariness built a post-war world. When guns fell silent, hundreds of hulls shifted cargoes from war stock to relief, grain and medicine for liberated cities, machinery for reconstruction, families crossing to new lives. Many ships went to reserve fleets at the mouths of American rivers. Others sailed under new flags into the commercial trades they had been born too abruptly to join. The next generation, the Victory ships with finer lines and faster turbines, carried lessons learned on panel lines and outfitting docks that had grown up around the Liberty. Welding stayed. Prefabrication stayed. The idea that a ship could be built to a clock stayed as a benchmark for crises to come. The moral lesson was harder to photograph and easier to feel. In 1942, contempt had been a weapon. Sneers from periscopes at slab sides and slow screws. By 1944, contempt had no column in the ledgers. The ocean paid in arrivals, not adjectives. A design sneered at as an ugly duckling proved that enough on time can defeat excellent too late. That truth touched every echelon. Yard workers discovered dignity in schedule and skill. Naval escorts discovered that technology plus doctrine plus mass can turn a predator into a quarry. Merchant sailors discovered that the odds, once hateful, could be bent. The cost was steady and personal. The merchant marine's casualty rate left empty bunks and names on plaques from Halifax to San Francisco. Naval armed guard gunners who had watched wakes streak toward their sterns kept watching to war's end. Repairs crews carried burns and stories that never made newsreels. Yet the balance held because the system held. Hulls produced faster than hulls were lost. Escorts trained faster than tactics could be countered. Air reached farther than fear had predicted. And an industrial metronome kept time for a sea that once had only lament. By VE Day, the Atlantic looked less like a battlefield and more like the artery of a rebuilt strategy. Stockpiles full, piers busy, trains rattling inland with cargoes that meant divisions in motion and civil life restarting. The U-boat arm remained lethal when it found a gap, but the gaps had narrowed into exceptions. In the end, the verdict belonged not to a single duel at sea but to a schedule ashore that never stopped. The film's last step is quiet. It asks what this victory meant beyond numbers, what it says about simplicity, persistence, and the way an ugly machine can change history by showing up. History often favors the sleek, fighters with clean wings, cruisers that knife the horizon. But oceans remember something plainer. They remember arrival, a ship that is there when the tide turns, a column that holds because there are enough hulls to fill it. The Liberty ship did not dazzle. She persisted. She taught a wartime generation that simplicity, when disciplined by a schedule, becomes a force. A straight deck and a blunt bow were not a failure of imagination. They were a declaration that the essentials, fuel, grain, trucks, crates of parts, would move whether the weather cooperated or not, whether a patrol line waited or not. Welded seams, panel-built houses, a triple expansion engine that any decent shop could keep breathing. Each choice lowered a barrier between need and delivery. Enough of those choices, repeated, changed the sea. There was a moral quiet to that change. The U-boat war had loved the dramatic, sudden wakes and breaking bows. The answer was untheatrical. It lived in shifts beginning at midnight, in foremen's clipboards, in launch whistles that became as ordinary as weather. It lived in escorts, turning toward a bearing with confidence, in air crews leaning on new instruments and a convoy commodore's relief when the third and fourth columns actually arrived. It lived in the stubborn fact that you can sink a ship only once and launch another again. Simplicity is not the enemy of courage. It is often its instrument. Merchant sailors climbed cold ladders and stood hot watches on ships built to be enough. Yard workers burned and lifted and learned. Escorts drilled until reflex replaced fear. The Liberty was their common denominator, a humble geometry that allowed other kinds of excellence to matter. When the guns fell silent, the lesson kept breathing. Prefabrication, welding, standardized parts, repair culture, the library of practices that grew around the ugly duckling, migrated into peacetime docs and emergency playbooks. The achievement did not rest in a single miracle hull rolled off in days. It rested in the habit that made weeks feel quick and deliveries feel inevitable. So the closing image is simple. A gray freighter slides down a ways into brown water. Sirens fade. The yard turns back to work. Far out, a convoy lane lies quiet under a low sky, and a slow ship holds her place because holding a place is what she was built to do. In that steadiness, a continent was supplied, an invasion made possible, and a predator's certainty undone by a schedule kept.